Hey, I'm glad you could join me back here in the studio today. Now we're going to do something for the next several sessions that a lot of us overlook as artists. So get your sketch pad, maybe a notepad, sit back, relax, and really have some fun with me as we learn some of the basic components of painting before you ever pick up a paintbrush. And that is the little thing called composition. Now composition is probably overlooked because we're living in such a fast-paced, push-button world. So many of us want to learn to paint before we really understand what it's all about. Now as I've traveled over the last 20 years teaching and holding workshops and seminars, I have come to realize that so many of us struggle with our painting because we don't really know what the basics are all about. Well, in the next few sessions we're going to cover some of the most important facts about painting, and that's going to mean that you're going to have to really concentrate and build a little notebook of the things that are under composition. It covers several things, so let's get started here. I'm going to give you a little list first, then we're going to go in and talk about composition, what it means, and how you actually develop a painting from square one before you ever pick up a paintbrush. Now I know it's exciting to play with color and throw color on, but you know what, folks? Every time I hold one of these composition classes somewhere in the country, it's the most popular class that I ever hold, even though it may be for a day or two. Everyone comes away with so much more information because now they can go back and on their own create much more exciting paintings. And quite frankly, if you know more about the basics, you won't be quite as frustrated, which is very important for an artist because we do get frustrated a lot. You'll be a little bit more inspired because you'll have more confidence about your painting. And another thing that's important is it makes your painting better, makes it better for the viewer. And remember one thing, and I've been studying some great artists over the years and worked with many, you can be the greatest artist, the greatest painter in the world, but if you don't understand the basic components of composition, design, perspective, color theory, and some of those basic things, your painting literally just falls apart at the seams. So what I'm going to attempt to do in the next few sessions is give you a real good basic grounding of how you can become a better artist. Now the first thing we're going to do is talk about composition and what it is, and I've brought some samples of some of my own paintings, which is a sort of a rare thing on the show here. Usually you just see my paintings I do for demonstrating and teaching purposes. So I'm going to have a few of my professional pieces now that will show you some composition techniques. Now the first thing about composition is the definition. Now this is not by the way, the Webster's version of what composition is. This is the artistic version, okay? Composition is simply the arrangement of objects on your canvas or your drawing paper or your watercolor paper, whatever it is you're working on, so that they are pleasing to the eye. Now that brings up an interesting question. Well, how do I know how to get from point A to point B? Well, here's the way it works, folks. When you talk about composition, you have to remember one thing. When you paint and draw, if your eye bounces around or runs off the canvas and has nothing to hold your attention, that's poor composition, okay? It's understood that your eye must maintain a focal point within the boundary of your canvas and stay there for it to be a good composition. So therefore that makes it more pleasing, all right? So I'm going to go through a whole range of do's and don'ts, and this will help some of you correct some of the paintings you already have done. Let's start first of all with some of the different types of things under composition. First of all, not only is composition the arrangement of objects on your canvas, but then you have design. Now we're going to talk about design in relation to composition, and there are three types of composition. We're going to go over those here after I give you a little bit of idea what they're about here. You have your triangle shaped composition, you have an L-shaped composition, and this one we call the center type of composition. Now let me give you another explanation here about what this is all about. Now every artist in the world has his or her own interpretation of what design, composition is all about. We all know that it has to be pleasing to the eye. And yes, there are many little theories. There's a lot of books out on the art market that talk about composition. But basically, and I've read most of them, we all have the same basic idea of what it takes to have a good composition. It's just that we all have our own little approach to get there. Now strictly as a beginner, a basic painter, or an intermediate painter, I'm going to teach you the basics of composition. At that point you can take this a step further into more advanced and professional techniques if you choose to, because some of the compositions get very complicated, which is what the triangle shaped composition is all about. And you'll know where you should spend most of your time, whether you're a basic beginner or an intermediate or an advanced painter. You know which area of the composition of these three types where you should spend most of your time. All right, after we talk about composition, design, and the three types of composition, that also encompasses some other things. We also have to talk about negative space. Now briefly, negative space is simply the space around an object. Let me give you an example here of a painting, and we're going to cover this more intensely later. But look at this cardinal painting. The space around the object, the area behind around the object, is called negative space. That's really what forms your object. It's not the outline of the object, it's the space you leave that creates the object. Okay, so that's what negative space is all about, and it's also the same rule that we use when we do trees or rock formations. It doesn't matter what you do, it's the space around your object that creates the most eye flow that's more conducive to good composition. Okay, so that's one thing. Another thing that we're going to cover under composition is how to create depth. Now depth is covered in a lot of ways. Of course, perspective is the key thing. So under depth, our key component is perspective. Now perspective is simply creating depth in a painting when you have objects that are receding into the distance, like a row of fence posts, the side of a building, when you're standing not square in front of it but to the side and you want to see it properly go into the distance. It also helps to create the illusion of all kinds of things in a painting. If you understand perspective, and we're going to cover two things, 1-point perspective and 2-point perspective. Okay? Those are the basic things we're going to cover in perspective, 1- and 2-point perspective. Now these, by the way, are designed for that landscape, the animal painter, seascape painter, mountain painter, or whatever type of painter you are. These particular items are designed for you specifically, so you'll have a good idea of what it's all about, because some of these go way, way, way on up into more advanced techniques, but you don't need to know about that just yet. Okay, then we're going to cover such things as shadows, reflections, planes, and a little bit about basic drawing. And we'll talk a little bit about color theory, how to create values and how to use the complementary color scheme to make your painting do its thing. But this is mostly geared towards you might say, the technical aspects of laying out a painting before you ever get started, okay? So now you can see some of the basic components we're going to cover. Make sure you write those down and have them ready, because we're going to cover them one at a time extensively, and it may take for the next several weeks, because perspective, composition, all of these things will take a whole program or more just on themselves. All right, now let's get started. I'm going to take this one off, lay it here so I can refer back to it also. Now, it'd probably be a good idea for those of you that are following me along here to have the proper tools. One of the things that I use is a piece of soft vine charcoal. Now, most of you know I use this in the painting programs because I use it to sketch with, and it works real well. It works good on this newsprint paper. Or if you prefer, you can use a 2B, a 4B, or even a 6B drawing pencil. A 2B or a 4B is best because they're fairly soft, but they're not too soft. A 6B is a little bit too soft, and it loses its point quicker. So I would recommend a 2B or a 4B drawing pencil and or a piece of soft vine charcoal, just to create sort of your little library of notes here. Now we're going to cover a lot of ground in the next few weeks, folks, so please don't hesitate to, if you get a little lost in this, to give us a call. We'll talk to you about it. We'll help you any way that we can, because my job is to make you understand it so that you can have a lot more fun with your painting. All right, the first thing about composition, you have to first research. Now let's talk about research for just a minute. Now, as I, again, teach people how to paint, so often I have people come into class, have all these great thoughts about painting, and they have things that they want to copy or duplicate. Folks, the first thing about composition is to understand your subject. So the first thing you want to do before you ever think about these basic components is your subject. What is your subject? That's number one. Now, believe it or not, more people don't even think about their subject before they might know they want to do a landscape, but they don't know what's going to happen in the landscape. So here's what happens when you get ready to design a painting. First, you need a subject. Number two, you need to come up with the objects that are going to be within the composition that are a part of your subject. For instance, if you're going to do, say, a mountain scene, well, maybe in that mountain scene you're going to have other objects. Maybe you're going to have a little mountain cabin or some pine trees, or maybe you're going to have a waterfall and some rocks or some bears or some deer. You've got to understand that before you ever start your painting, you've got to have a fairly good picture, a roadmap, so to speak, of where you're going. So first you have your subject, whatever type of thing it might be, then the objects within that range of subjects, and then number three, the next thing, and probably one of the most important things, is you need to pick your atmospheric condition. Okay, now that simply means what time of the year is it, or basically what's happening on that particular painting. Is it snowing? Is it going to be cold and windy, wet and rainy? You have to decide in this painting so that you can begin adjusting in your own thoughts in your mind. Next is what's the atmosphere, okay? So then you can automatically almost go right into your color scheme, all right? So after you've established what your atmosphere is, you need to get the time of day. Now, a lot of us make mistakes in our painting when we have a lot of things happen. We may have a sunset, but we have our shadows geared towards, say, mid-afternoon, or we may have an early morning part of our painting, and our painting's all confused. So it's very important that you know what time of the day it is, and you be consistent with all your shadows, reflections, anything that's going to be affected by the time of day. That's important, okay? I see more mistakes made in that area. The next thing that you want to talk about is color scheme. Okay? Now, after you've established the basic research material, your subject, what objects are going to be there, the atmosphere, the time of day, then you have to start thinking about your color scheme. Now, most of us nowadays are thinking more in terms of what's decorative, okay? And that's fine if that's what you choose to do. I don't like to paint that way. I paint whatever fits the mood at the time I'm in, the mood of the painting at the time. I don't really care if it's going to match my couch or my carpet or my wall. I paint what's best for the painting at the time, okay? Not to say you can't come back later and add accent colors, especially if it's a commission piece. Now, I do lots of commissions for collectors around the country, and a lot of times I have to throw in these things to make it a little bit more conducive to their color scheme, which is okay. But for the most part, to begin your painting, you need to come up with a color scheme that's conducive to your subject, the objects in there, and all the other components of your research material. Now, folks, once you've established in your mind where you're going with these basic things, then the very next thing you do is what we call thumbnail sketches, okay? Now, so many times when we start painting, we just start painting or sketching and we don't even plan ahead. You see, it's kind of like building a house. You can't build a house without a good foundation. You can't build it without a good set of plans. You can't just start building. Oh, you can, but you make lots of mistakes. Sometimes you make some fatal mistakes that may cause the thing to fall down or have to start over or whatever. So if you'll draw yourself a good roadmap to any painting you do, you're going to eliminate a lot of the frustration and the fear of painting that so many of us as beginners have. So the next thing you're going to do is what we call thumbnail sketches. And here's what a thumbnail sketch is. Now, we get the term thumbnail sketch, and of course this is a term that's been around forever from artists. A thumbnail sketch is simply a smaller version of what you intend to put on your finished piece. And it's just little compositions like this. It could be a vertical, rectangle shape, whatever your canvas size or your paper size is going to be. You've already established in your mind that you're going to have certain things, and a thumbnail sketch may only be a 30-second sketch, okay? And it will have the basic components of your painting. For instance, maybe a mountain, It may also include some study notes, color schemes that you've seen or observed, textures, atmospheres, smells, and all those things that go into a painting. Maybe, you just give a quick line here. Maybe you know where your pine trees are going to go. Maybe there's a little house setting up here in the distance. Maybe there's a footpath that's going down into the middle of the painting, and maybe there's a big rock over here, or some mud puddles, or a fence post. What you'll do is, after you've established your subject, you get some of your objects in your mind, and you're using photographs or whatever you're working from, which, by the way, I'll show you a little bit about that. In completing our last series of paintings, remember we were using the old mill. Well, I took endless dozens of these photographs to create, in my mind, all the different subjects that I was going to be using in my painting. All right, well, the main subject, of course, is the barn, but within there you have different objects. You have the trees, you have the bridge, you have the water, you have a lot of different things, folks. You have the old wheel that turns the grinder, that grinds up into flour. Here's part of it in here. I took lots of different angles. There's the water coming over that turns the wheel. All right, you may take lots. There's some close-ups of some trees there on the other side that we put in the background. Here's the other side of the bank. These are all things, folks, that you have to have in advance so that when you get this settled, you can move right into your thumbnail sketches and you can begin developing your painting. And what I normally do with my thumbnail sketches, and by the way, I may do 15 or 20 or maybe 30 or 40 thumbnail sketches before I ever settle on the one that best suits my needs, okay? Well, quite frankly, it's not going to do you a whole lot of good to do a thumbnail sketch unless you know what's going to happen in all the other basic components of composition. So now that we've covered all the basics and the things you need to be prepared for, let's get into the real meat of what composition is all about. Okay, now you know where you're headed. So let's draw sort of our first layout, our first type of composition, which is what we call an L-shaped composition, okay? Now let me give you some real good information. Let's draw a nice canvas here. We'll call this a thumbnail sketch, if you will. Just something loose and free that will not be something you're going to use for any finished piece. Now let me tell you, when you pick an L-shaped composition, let me give you a sort of a good example. An L-shaped composition is selected for your type of painting when it's a simple subject. All right, now let me give you a couple of thoughts about this. What an L shape simply means is, if you go back to the basic definition of composition, it's the arrangement of objects on your canvas so that it's pleasing to the eye. Think about the eye flow in an L, okay? L shape. Either to the right or to the left. See, this L could go either direction. Now, before we get into this, let me tell you some of the basic components of composition that make or break whichever type you choose. You need to have the following things in these compositions. You need to have eye stoppers. Well, I didn't say I was a great speller. I'm just an artist. You need to have eye stoppers, which create a section in the painting where your eye will stop before it goes off of the canvas. Now I'm going to bring out a painting here that I want you to take a look at here, and this is really what an L-shaped composition is all about. Okay, let's think about this for just a moment, if you will. Now, when I developed this painting, I already had in mind that I was going to do a desert scene, sort of in the desert southwest. I wanted these great big rock formations. That was settled. I wanted sort of a late afternoon, midday scene with a clean, clear sky. I had all those things established in my mind, okay? But it's so simple, I knew I couldn't have a lot of other objects or any other subjects that make this thing work. I wanted the rocks themselves to be what was all about. So because of its simplicity, folks, I automatically knew that the L-shaped composition was going to be the one I would have to work from. Now, let me show you something, and I'm going to do something here that will scare you just a little bit, but that's okay. I'm used to doing that. Let me get a paper towel here. Now, I want you to think for a minute, just before I do this, you think, what is the movement of your eye in this particular painting? Which direction does your eye flow? All right, let's think about it. My eye goes down like this, and flows across like this. Now, a lot of us don't even think about that until you're taught that. That's why I'm so excited to spend the next few weeks with you going over all of these wonderful little tricks that make painting so exciting, because it's sort of behind the scenes kind of things that most of us don't even think about. When you look at this painting, yes, you see all of the other things going on in here, but my main subject is the beautiful rock formations, and my eye flows in the shape of an L. All right, now let me talk to you about some of the other components of the L-shaped composition that are so exciting. Number one, now remember we talked about eye stoppers. Now before I say it, can you find out on this painting where the eye stoppers are? Think about it just a second. I'll let you focus for a minute. We've already established that our eye flows this way, or it could have been the other way if the rocks had been over here. But because of the strong movement of the eye, what would this be? That would be your eye stopper. Isn't that exciting? Eye stoppers are the other objects that are in your painting that stop you from going off of the canvas, and that will keep you well within the range of the L-shaped composition. Now, there are many different uses for this L-shaped composition, and I just don't have time to go over all of them with you. I'll give you a few little rough sketches in a minute to show you some other uses for it. But now let's talk about some of the other components. Now, you still have a lot of other things going on in the painting, okay? Now I want everyone to pay attention here. An L-shaped composition is generally the object, the center of interest itself, okay? For instance, this could just be a large tree here that's beautifully leafed out, or a dead tree, and it's the main feature in the painting, so your eye follows like this. And the way the L works, if you'll notice, I've used other helpers, okay, to get to my eye stopper and back again. What have we used here, folks, to help my eye in this composition? Think about it for a minute, all right? Now, I have used ridges, the washes, the erosion in the dirt to create movement, all right? So when my eye comes down, look at these little ridges. Everything gently gets me moving, including the more distant, faded out ridges on those back mountains. Even though they aren't the feature, they still aid in the composition of the basic flow of the L. Okay? Look what else. I've got all of these ridges here. The washes and the erosion. I've got the subtle use of brush and rock formations and the grasses that create a movement. All right, and when it comes across, now look what happens. It comes across like this. We hit this beautiful bright sunlit section, then pow, all of a sudden we hit this really exciting little explosion of brush and color. And it's really, what it does is it stops your eye, but it also is so attractive you want to stay there for just a second. But you know what? I'm going to give you a real good piece of advice here. Never allow your eye stoppers, this is critical, never allow your eye stoppers to compete with your main subject or the center of interest, okay? Write that down or review this tape again, but never allow an eye stopper to compete with your center of interest. It's okay for it to have some nice little design and some color, but it's real bad if you let it become too important in the painting, because then you start moving into some more of the advanced categories, and there's some other rules you have to follow to get to there. So we've conquered the first phase of composition, and that's the L shape, okay? All the rest of the stuff is just filler material. It does not compete with any of the rest of the painting. I've got darker colors in the foreground and shadow so that I don't focus. I have less detail. Those are the things that make the L-shaped composition work. You focus on the subject itself where your eye flows, and you can still get away with lots of other subjects. For instance, beautiful tree with the contrast against the rocks. It's really a neat subject, but it doesn't compete because it's part of it, okay? So that's important. It would have been a bad decision to make a huge tree right here and compete with this. So I just made it part of it. All right, does that make sense to you? Isn't that exciting? Now there's 1,000 takeoffs from this, all right? Now let's put this down. And let me give you another quick example here because we're running out of time, as usual. But say, for instance, and of course I'm from the Midwest, and say I've got a little prairie here, and I have a windmill here. And I'm just going to use simple sketches here, just as a practical matter. Now I've already gone through all my things. I know what I want to do here. I just got to compose it now. I have a windmill, and it's the main subject. Well, most windmills have a water tank, okay? Well, if I put the water tank over here, what happens? You now have split the composition in half right down the middle, and you bounce to it instead of flow with it. So the secret here is to create an overlap. Put the tank here slightly overlapping the windmill. Let's just see if we can rub that off a little bit. Okay. Now you've created an eye flow, but just by itself it's still not very interesting. Yes. Yeah, you can go back like we had on the other painting, some distant hills. You can have some little bushes. You can have a beautiful shadow here from an evening sun or a morning sun. And now you've got an eye flow. And what if I wanted to put some cows in there? Whoa, what would that do to us? Well, as long as the cows are a part of the L, you can put them in there if you want to. But just don't put them way over here. See, if you put any other objects over here that compete with the main subject, you're going to get yourself in trouble, and then you lose the beautiful eye flow that you wanted to create with the simplistic approach to this. So your cattle would be here, all right? All right, these are pretty good looking cows, aren't they? As long as they overlap your subject and they are part of the L, then you can get away with adding a lot of different objects, folks, and still have an incredible composition, okay? Well, we're out of time for this segment. Next week we're going to continue with composition and get into some of the more complicated forms and a lot of other things. It's going to be a lot of fun. So God bless you. Stay inspired, keep painting, and we'll see you again real soon on another Inspiration of Painting. Hey, I'm glad you could join me again today. It's going to be a wonderful thing now to continue on with our composition classes, because one of the things that's so exciting about this is that we are going to move forward now with the next composition, which is the triangle-shaped composition. However, I want to give you a quick rundown on what we accomplished last week so that make sure that you didn't forget or lose anything. Now remember, we left off last time talking about the L-shaped composition, okay? Using the L to create the eye flow, the use of eye stoppers and other objects to create interest, but your main eye flows with your object or your main center of interest, okay? So that's a critical part of composition, especially if you're a beginner. That's the one you'll use most of the time. Now, if you're going to move on into some other areas of painting, want to get more advanced, so to speak, our next type of composition is going to be the triangle-shaped composition, and there are about 3 different versions of a triangle composition, okay? So we're going to really concentrate on that today. Now, we spoke a lot about composition last week, kind of broke into the idea of what it is. Today, we're going to talk about the triangle-shaped composition. Okay, now then, when you think about a triangle, folks, most of us think about that geometrical figure, the perfectly shaped 3-sided figure of a triangle, okay? Now, in composition for a painting, and for all practical purposes, it's just the general basic eye flow that we're after that kind of creates the form of a triangle. It may be kind of an odd-shaped triangle, but that's the look you're after. However, before we get started here, I want to give you a little bit of just a tidbit of information about how you can do some composing on your own when you're out in the field. Now, I mentioned to you last week that it's a good idea to have a lot of reference material handy. We talked about that. Take lots of photographs. A good 35mm camera is excellent. But one thing I do when I'm composing something and I want to have a big tree in there or any other object for that matter, if I'm not sure how it's going to look, I will make my own little viewfinder out of a piece of paper. And the way you do this is you just take a piece of paper and you fold it in half. And then you take some scissors or a pocket knife, which I just used, and you cut out whatever the shape of your canvas is going to be, whether it's vertical or horizontal. Okay, then when you open it up, you see you have the shape of whatever canvas. Now, it may be tall, it may be wider, it doesn't matter. So try to get at the shape of whatever canvas you're working on. Now, let's see if we can use this painting over here as an example, all right? We're going to use this, when you look through here, and I don't know if they can do this with the camera or not, but you can only see certain parts of that painting, all right? In this case, let me just look through here. If I want to have the house and one of the doves, I move this around to where it's compositionally correct, using the things that we've talked about last week or in our other sessions, and that's what you need to be doing here. All right, so you can move this around. If you're outdoors, you can clip this to the top of a tree limb, you can move it around, you can put it on a stick, and you can see your composition and the things you want to have in here. And this sort of is your eye stopper, kind of keeps your eye from, looking at other things. It's a wonderful opportunity for you to use just a simple object or a simple thing to create your composition, all right? So that's a fun thing to use when you're out in the field. It really is effective, simple tool, doesn't cost you hardly anything, and all your great artists use that. So that's just a fun little thing I wanted to throw at you. Now, getting back to composition. Now remember, when we talk about composition, we talk about a lot of things, folks. We're talking about different subjects and different objects, and the more you add to your painting, now this is where this next series is so important, the more subjects you add to your painting, or more objects, the more complicated it becomes, and you need to have some more rules or guidelines to go by. All right, so let's talk about this for a second. A triangle-shaped composition will be used. You'll know to select that type of composition. And remember now, you're going to, after you've done your research, after you've established in your mind where you're going, what type of composition, then here is what you have to decide next. How many objects are going to be in here? For instance, say you do a thumbnail here, and you already know you're going to have a mountain, so you do a quick thumbnail of this mountain, okay? But perhaps you know also you're going to have a waterfall. Okay, so you're going to have this waterfall coming over these rocks. Remember, these are just thumbnails, just to give you an idea. All right? The next thing you think in your mind you want to have in this painting is, you want to have some big fluffy clouds. Maybe a storm brewing here. And you're saying to yourself, okay, in this painting I'd like to have some pine trees. All right, so you have pine trees. And in this painting you've decided you want to have a log cabin. Okay, see, it gets a little more complicated, Where in the world are you going to put your log cabin? Well, you may have to establish another layer of ground back there, another plane, another part of the painting to put this cabin on right here. Okay, and it sets way back here in the distance, just in front of the mountain. Okay, then you're going to say to yourself, well, I better have maybe a deer standing in here. Where am I going to put the deer? All right, so you establish that you're going to have that subject or object in there. Then you've got grasses and you've got big boulders in the foreground. Okay, my point here, folks, is the more things you add to your painting or the more objects you think you need, you've got to have a format to follow that will give you good eye flow. Remember the definition. Composition is the arrangement of objects on your canvas so that it is pleasing to the eye. All right, so once you've established how many objects you want in there, we now go to the triangle-shaped composition. In the first form of a triangle, and there are three different types. The first triangle-shaped composition is the type where your eye will follow the shape of the triangle. Let me give you a good example here. Let's go over here to the painting on the wall. Now I want everyone to pay close attention to this. This is very, very important. Now, in reality, the painting is truly quite simple, but I've got 2 or 3 main objects now that I want to focus on, you see, as opposed to the L-shaped composition that we spoke of in this painting, where we only had one main object and it follows the L. Okay? Here we have 3 different objects that are important to the painting. Watch what happens when I follow the proper technique for the triangle-shaped composition. Now, I'm going to use the charcoal. Don't panic because it wipes right off, okay? when I look at this, of course, I see the house, I see the dove, I see the barbed wire, I see the clouds and the grasses, and all those things are there. But what characteristic did this composition have? Oh, here we are. We go from the house, just watch this, your eye starts here, generally speaking. It follows this line across. We have a fence, two different types. We have horizontal movement in the ground. We have this ridge of trees. We have clouds, and then we hit this ridge of trees. We go to our other focal point, and all of a sudden what happens, folks? Your eye then follows this line. Now, because you have eliminated any detail on this section of the painting, now think about this for a minute, this no longer is in contention with the rest of the objects that are your main subjects. So this is not a matter of concern to you. Now, it would be a problem if you started putting a lot of stuff in here, and that's where I find most of us make our mistakes, folks. We think we have to have everything in the world in there, and we put too much emphasis on things that surround our main subjects or our center of interest, and we forget that that will create a detraction and a deterrent to your proper eye flow. So let me give you a little bit more information. When you have selected your main subjects, you have created the perfect eye flow, please don't allow your eye stoppers or any other subjects or object in here to compete with your center of interest, okay? Folks, I can't tell you how important that is. That's critically important. Never allow any objects to compete with your center of interest once you've selected it, okay? So take a look one more time. Your eye flows, and you've created this triangle. Right? Isn't that exciting? Now, most of us never would have thought about that before. But now I've got eye stoppers here. I've got eye stoppers here, and frankly, these pull my eye back in. They overlap the wire a little bit. I come down, and I want you to notice something. Even down here in the shadowed part, I eliminated a lot of the highlighting that's on the wire simply because I didn't want it to catch my eye. Or I kept it in shadow. So there's a nice, simple type of triangle-shaped composition. But it's a little more complicated than the L shape that we spoke of. We have three main subjects, and they are the triangle. So that's one type. Let me give you another example here, and I'll pull out a painting here, one of my prints. All right, let's take a look at this. Now, think about this one for a second. I also have several things in here that I want to be focused on. I love the dead trees. I needed the geese and the ducks in here, or just the geese. I wanted some nice background atmosphere. But I want you to notice what kind of triangle, what kind of composition we have. It's a triangle. All right, let's move back over here to the board where I can explain this a little bit easier. All right. Now then, take a good look at this. And let's take a look at where our eye stoppers are and where our eye flow is. Now, because I wanted all the trees, I wanted the sunset, I wanted just a sort of a pastel painting, my main focus, of course, is what? The geese. All right? Well, as opposed to the one we just looked at where we had several different subjects or objects, we now have created a triangle shape that's all inclusive in one little triangle, okay? I want everyone to pay attention to this. All right, notice my eye flow. Here, I hit this limb, I come back down, what do? All right, we follow the shape of our eye stays well within this range, and you've created this triangle. Now, normally you wouldn't recognize it as a triangle until you've been taught the proper way to make it work. Now, what are the use of the other objects in here? Those are your eye stoppers and the filler material that truly finish the painting but don't compete with your main center of interest. See, the secret to a good painting is you have to have a center of interest. So here's what I do. Look away for a minute. Focus on it. What do you look at right away? You focus on the geese. Why do you focus on the geese? You focus on the geese because we've properly arranged the other objects so that you will spend time here and not out here and not over here. And yes, we have a movement this way, but I kept my eye from going off by putting the tree all the way up and bring all these limbs back down into so that my eye stays within the triangle. Does everybody understand that? Isn't that exciting how you can actually use your center of interest as the actual triangle? So that's the first type of composition where you're using the triangle shape, that is where the actual center of interest are the triangle themselves. Now that's one way. Now don't forget, your eye stoppers are very critical, folks, but they should not compete with your main center of interest. Okay, please remember that. You're going to get tired of me telling you about that, but that's the truth. All right, now let's put this one aside and let's go to the next type of triangle shape composition. Okay, now I've got one here that's kind of interesting. And remember now, all of these are different versions of a triangle, and there are many, many takeoffs, okay? Now the next type of triangle shape composition is where you have let's say your center of interest is right here, and you may have several triangles that point to your center of interest, all right? As opposed to the one where your center of interest is the subject itself. Now we have a center of interest, and I'll show you an example here, with triangles that point to that. In other words, where all of the points of the triangle come together in different angles, and that's where your eye focuses. Now when you look at this painting here called No Stranger Here of these cardinals, how in the world, other than the fact that those cardinals are, of course, are bright red and it's complemented with the green park bench, how are we going to keep our eye there? What is the point? What makes that work? Well, here's how it works. Now, until I point this out to you, sometimes it's really hard to see it. My focus is, when you first look at this, of course, is the cardinal, this first cardinal right here. And then you, of course, notice the bench and the other cardinals and so forth and so on. Now, remember what I told you. We're not talking about a perfect geometrical triangle. We're just talking about the basic flow in a triangle formation. And it may vary from painting to painting. Notice what we've got here. I wanted my focal point to be here. I established that by going over all of my basics in the beginning. All right. Now look what I've done. I knew I didn't want to have a whole lot of stuff in here to take my eye away, but I didn't want to leave myself off either. So the first thing I do is I put me a tree over here with a tree limb that comes back in. And look what my eye does. What does it do, folks? It follows back down towards my main subject. Then I take another look at this and I say, okay, that helps that side, but what about the other part of this? Well, here I put a collection of trees that are so powerful and so strong that they could become a deterrent to the composition unless I did what? Yes, you got it. I overlapped my objects with the park bench, and you could, in effect, almost make an L-shaped composition out of this if you didn't have all the space around it that you needed to get back into the center. And it's a little more complicated. So here we have another triangle. You see? Here, you've created a triangle here, and if you pull all of your lines back into here, you create a triangle type effect that causes you to focus right here at this part of the painting. So sometimes you have a subject where you will have other objects that lead you to the center of interest, creating several triangles that focus in one spot. Okay? So that's another use for triangles, and it's one of the more complicated uses because sometimes we will put too much in it. So let me show you something. Notice how simplistic the rest of the painting is. In fact, from about this tree back, you don't even see any detail there. You can't tell if that's sky, if it's water, or what it is. That's what it's all about. It's called depth of field. It's very much like taking a photograph and you let the background be a little blurry or a little bit distorted so that you'll focus here. And that's what we've done, folks. We've focused here with all of our detail. We've eliminated detail here and here and here and here, and we've focused our detail right here where the triangles meet and form to create the center of interest. Isn't that exciting? Tell you what, when I learned this technique for creating composition, it improved my paintings 100%. Most of the national awards that I've won have been on my strength of composition, and that's what I like to teach because it will improve your painting and you'll be a lot happier. Okay, now you understand a little bit about that. Let's put this one away, and we're going to move into another type of composition now of the triangle. Actually, let's take another look here at one more little piece of information about the one I just spoke of. Now, this is kind of an interesting painting, and it kind of goes back to the first type of composition we spoke of, because I wanted you to see something here. It doesn't matter what subject you're doing, folks. It doesn't matter what time of the day, what kind of atmosphere you have. As long as you compose well, you can do anything. Where does your eye flow in this painting? Okay, think about this for just a second. This bird is pulling me down. Okay, I hit the wagon, and because the wagon's angled this way, okay, come back here, here's my triangle. All right, here again, because I wanted my subject to be focused right in the center here, this is a type of composition where the actual center of interest is the triangle itself. This is your eye stopper on this side, this is your eye stopper on this side, and of course you have your helpers that pull your eye back in there. So remember, you can do anything you want to. This just gives you another example of a type of painting where you can use one or the other types of triangle compositions. And it's a fairly complicated painting. It has a lot of stuff in it, but because it was arranged properly and it doesn't compete with this, this is where my eye flows and you focus there, and it's just beautiful, okay? So that's kind of exciting. Now I'm going to give you probably another one that's one of the more complicated types of composition as far as a triangle go. Now, the next type of triangle composition, and this quite frankly would be when you really have a whole lot of things going on in your painting. You have a lot of subjects, and you're saying to yourself, okay, maybe you've got a commission to do for someone. And you're sitting there thinking, well, here's the list of things that went in this painting. Of course, artistically, you may have to eliminate some things or add some things to make it work. But there may be quite a few things in here. Well, this is the kind of composition where you may have a triangle, say like this, and your object is within the triangle, okay? Now let me square all this away with you. The first type of composition we used where the actual objects was the triangle. The second type that we just talked about is where you had several triangles pointing toward your center of interest. The third type of triangle composition is where you may have a triangle that is surrounded by objects and your focal point is within the triangle. Now let me give you a good example on this one. And let's see here. It's a lot of fun. Here we go. Okay. This is kind of an interesting painting because this is something that I love to paint, some of the Southwest types of things. But now I want everyone to take a quick look at this. Just kind of focus for a second. And you think where your eye is focused right now. Now, forget about the triangle for the moment. Just think where your eye focuses for a second. My eye immediately goes to the teepee. All right? How come it does that? Well, that's the next thing you want to think about, folks, because if you don't put a lot of emphasis on how you got there, you're going to end up with a lot of problems for yourself. All right, well, I knew in this particular painting, which, by the way, was a commission from one of my collectors, he wanted the teepee, a little bit of a setting. He wanted the, like someone's there. He wanted the deer over here, and he wanted it set in a snow scene in the wintertime, of course, with lots of trees in the forest, on the edge of a forest. Well, that gave me quite a challenge because that simply meant I got to put a lot of things in here to make it work. And he wanted the stream and the frozen water and all that stuff. All right, so the first thing I did was I located on my sketch where I wanted the teepee. I went ahead and just sort of sketched it in my thumbnail. I put it on a hillside, all right? So I knew I wanted to focus there. I knew he wanted all these other objects in there, and so I was going to have to come up with a solution to the problem. Well, here's what I decided. After about 15 or 20 thumbnail sketches, playing with different ideas, I decided that I would put the teepee on the hill. I would go ahead and put the camp around it and, kind of finish that section out so it would have a lot of strength there. And then I decided that in an effort to really focus my eye here, I would put a big tree on this side, which sort of frames in that part of the painting. See, what you're actually doing with this type of triangle composition is you're using the triangle as a frame to frame your subject, your center of interest, so to speak. So I want to focus here. So here's the first thing I did. Here's the first thing that comes up. That's sort of the edge of a triangle. Then by bringing my limbs in and down, watch what happens and see where the triangle is. This is so exciting to me. I just get excited every time I think about this. My limbs come down, and look what I did though. I've made sure that my background trees also followed this line of eye flow. Okay, take a look. It comes down and it kind of gets stuck right here on this deer. All right, which is a good thing because all of a sudden now the deer becomes an eye stopper, the tree becomes a helper to the eye stopper, and now we can come back this direction and we have a log that is sort of buried into the other side of the triangle. And you see how your eye flows up and around your object. Now folks, keep in mind that this is the most complicated of all. So this would be for those of you that are going a little beyond the basics into the more intermediate, advanced, and eventually professional level of painting. But even at that, it's important for you to realize that if you're in the basic range of learning how to paint, to stay away from some of this stuff, because I have seen more beginners get into so many things before they're ready, and that's what causes discouragement. My job is to help you understand where you need to be at this particular point in your career as an artist. And right now, this type of composition will take you a long ways after you've learned some of the other basics. So let's study this one more time. We go up, I go across, we come down, we then flow back this way, following the edge of the water. We hit our tree, and we come back up, back down, across, back up. There's your triangle. Isn't that exciting? Now, what have we got in here that aids in that composition? Where are our eye stoppers? Well, one of them we talked about was the deer. Now, he is not the focal point. He is another subject that we want to see because this particular person wanted the deer, and they're sort of as a symbolic thing with the deer and the Indian. So we had to put him in there. Now, I could have gotten away without him and been perfectly happy, and it wouldn't have made a big difference. It wouldn't have made the painting good or bad. It just would have been not there. But because the composition is so well designed, it didn't matter, because that's where I want to focus. All right, so we come down here. The deer becomes an eye stopper. All the bushes and the weeds become eye stoppers. This log could have stopped us cold in our tracks if we hadn't angled it. So now we can get underneath it, follow the angle of the water, back up. We let the darkness of the water here keep us from going off. Over here, we let the darkness of the snow keep us from going off. And we pull our weeds back towards the center, so that gets you back up into the line. You see, folks, your eye stoppers are aids to getting you back on track to your triangle shape or whatever composition you're using. That's what that's for. You see it goes up, hits this. So if you happen to wonder a little bit out here what you're going to do because of this, look what I did, because you're going to get into this problem once in a while. He had to have the dead log in there for whatever reason, okay? So I figured, well, if we're going to have a dead log in there, let's have it part of the composition. So I've got it angled here, of course, pointing up towards the teepee. It's coming back here and it's interesting, but now it hits this line of snow and it doesn't go off anymore. All of a sudden my eye hits this line of snow and gets me back on track with my triangle, okay? So you see, folks, everything has an important part in your composition. So we've used everything that we've talked about. We've put our eye stoppers in place. We have good composition. We've used the proper color scheme, which we'll talk more about in some of our next sessions. Well, as usual, we're out of time, and here's one of the things I want to end with on this particular session. Whenever you get ready to choose a composition, please be sure that it fits the proper use of your subject or your objects. In other words, if you've got a simple object you want to focus on, use the simple composition. If you have a lot of complicated things, use another type. Be sure you understand when to use the right composition. And one of the last things, don't forget, whenever you're ready to start your composition, always make several thumbnail sketches first. Get an idea in your head where you're going, then you can come back and start laying it out, okay? Now, in our next session, we're going to concentrate on the center type composition, which is going to be a situation like this where we have a portrait, a figure, or an animal, and there's no background, okay? So that'll be our focus in our next session. I look forward to seeing you then. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. God bless you, stay inspired, and keep painting. We'll see you again real soon on another Inspiration of Painting. Well, I'm glad you could join me back here in the studio again. We're going to go ahead and continue on with our little talk about composition, design, perspective, and some of the other things that make a great painting really great. Remember, we've covered quite a bit of information now about the different types of composition. Now we're ready to move into another one. Okay, today we're going to discuss more specifically the center type composition, which is going to involve mostly things where you're going to be doing portraits, figure work, still lives, or anything close up where the only subject or where the main object in your painting is your center of interest or your main subject. Now remember, just to give you a little brief recap of where we've been, we've talked about the L-shaped composition and the different types of triangle-shaped compositions. It's really interesting, and I hope you grasp a little bit of it so that now when you go back and sort of design your own landscapes or whatever, you'll have a little bit easier time of it. Now, there are a lot of you, though, that don't like to do landscapes. Perhaps you're more into portraits or figure work or other types of things. So we're going to discuss now the center type composition, which directly involves itself with negative space, okay? Now we're going to talk at length today about negative space, one of the most important components of design and of composition, okay? So pay real close attention, get your notepad out or your sketch pad or both, and let's have some fun today learning a little bit more about composition. Now, let me draw a simple little sketch here. Whoops, all kinds of stuff there. Okay, now for instance, we've covered the other types of composition. By the way, remember now, as you design your painting, always be sure that you select the composition that best suits the subject or the types of subjects or objects that you have in for your painting. In this case, say for instance, we just want to do a simple vase of flowers or a bowl of fruit or a basket of fruit or whatever. Remember something. When you have one object that is your focal point, that's called a center type composition. And here's a good example. Now I showed this to you before, but take a good look at this. Isn't this an exciting painting? Isn't this wonderful to just see one thing grasp your attention and hold it for a long time? But if it's not composed properly, folks, it will absolutely fall apart at the seams. In other words, the important aspect of a center type composition is the use of negative space. That's the space around your objects, okay? Now this beautiful male cardinal here, what holds my attention is I've taken the space around my object and I've organized it in a fashion that makes my eye flow gracefully around my object and not bounce around, okay? So it's important to understand in a center type composition that your negative space is by far the most critical aspect of that. And then after we talk about that, I'll show you how negative space plays an important part in the other compositions, the triangle and the L shape that we spoke of earlier. All right, for instance, now say we're going to have a vase of flowers and we're going to have it sitting on a table with a window. You already know the basic components, which we discussed before. You have to know where you're headed. So let's draw a window here, just for the heck of it. Now once again, we're back to doing what we call our thumbnail sketches, and we're going to go ahead and just do some rough stuff. And let's get our window in here. Well, let's just break it up like that. And now we're going to have a table sitting here. Let's put our table, and we have our vase of flowers. Now we've got a problem already. You see, folks, our main object here, or the main subject, is the vase of flowers. That's what we wanted to focus on. Remember the rule, anytime your main subject competes with its helpers or the eye stoppers or anything else in the painting, your composition no longer works properly. It's not a nice eye flow. I guess I want to repeat the composition rule. Composition is the arrangement of objects on your canvas so that it's pleasing to the eye. What makes this unpleasing is you now have a window that's separated from your main object or your center of interest. Therefore, you create a pocket of negative space that's not interesting. So even if you put your flowers in here and you arrange those properly as per the rule of negative space and so forth, that may be the most beautiful vase of flowers in the world. But like I told you earlier, you can be the greatest painter that ever existed, but without a good knowledge of composition and design, your painting falls apart. So here's what happens when you do this. You have a beautiful vase of flowers. You have your table sitting here. and you have your window, and really what you've done is you've divided your canvas in half, so you really have two paintings, and neither one of them are very interesting. All right, so how would you correct that? Well, let me show you, first of all, a little bit more about how we use negative space. Whenever you're starting to draw or sketch something, and this will come into a little bit more in the basic drawing section that we're going to have a little later, you always look at the space around your object as you draw it. Most of us have a tendency, for instance, let me just take this paper cup for instance. When we draw the cup, we have a tendency to want to draw the cup as we see it. Now, most of us just do that because that would be the normal thing to do. Artistically speaking, you can't quite get from point A to point B just by drawing the outline of the cup. Because as it sits on a table or in relation to another object, you're all of a sudden creating other spaces around the object that makes your eye flow gracefully or bounce in a very, you might say a very ugly way. Okay, for instance, now let's take the window. There's no problem really with the window being located, say, right there. Now, for those of you that are in the craft area of your work and you do a lot of flower arranging, remember now there are some rules that we can follow right along here. Number one, you want to have some overlap, okay? So overlapping is a very crucial part of painting. So let's move the vase over. Instead of having it here, where we have separated it with a piece of negative space that's not interesting anymore, let's put our vase, say, right here. A little bit closer to the window. Now when you put your flowers in, you see, or your weeds and all the stuff, you will now overlap the window, and the window now becomes a secondary, it's not as interesting or it's not as important as the vase of flowers. Now the vase of flowers, of course, should be intricately done. They should have all the components of good design, good use of space, but here's the secret. Okay, let's just kind of throw out a few little sketches here. The window all of a sudden is in the background. It's not important anymore. The vase now takes center of interest. But look what we've done. We now have space on each side. What happens when you create this pocket of space? Notice something, how my eye flows now. See? It flows in and around in some very interesting movements. Here, it flowed a little bit, but it didn't really have any place to go. When it got here, it went straight down here, and I focused on the window. So we actually are competing with each other, and that's one of the worst things that can happen. Here, there's no competition because the use of space. So when you draw the flowers, whatever you're doing, or the vase, don't just look at the shape of your object, but look at the space you're leaving around the object. That's what makes it look good. Pulling up this painting again, here's the whole point. If I had moved this cardinal way over here, where I didn't have any good space here or here, maybe I would have overwhelmed myself with too much space. If I had made this cardinal blend in too much to the shape of the bush or made the bush a little different and didn't have nice movement, it would become very uninteresting, all right? So remember that negative space is the space that forms the object, and that's what you want to look to when you're creating good design to your object and good eye flow for good composition. All right, now that applies to almost everything you paint, folks. And I'm going to bring out another painting here that I think you'll find very, very interesting. And one of the most important things about this particular painting is, well, let's see if we can find it here. There we go. Now this is called Sitting Still. Now this is a little rabbit that's hidden in the bushes. Okay, this is one of my favorite paintings that I've done for years and years and years. It's been one of the most popular of our prints. When you look at this, what do you see right away? Well, I didn't want this to be a big, complicated painting. I wanted to paint the rabbit to be sort of hidden in the bushes, and I didn't want the bushes to necessarily be in competition with my main subject. So what I decided to do was focus. What do you see when you first look at this particular painting? You see the eye. it hits you almost instantly. And all of a sudden, because of all of the weeds and things in here that blend in with the painting instead of compete with the painting, you create a very unusual object that stands out, and then you begin focusing in on the rest of the rabbit as he stays hidden in the bushes. Therefore, you now have a center type composition where you utilize the entire canvas and you don't really have any negative space to speak of that's causing any problems. Now, let me give you an example of what would happen if you eliminated some of this area. See, if you had See the space between your weeds, this space here, is called negative space. If I had just left it space with lots of white snow behind there, then it becomes in direct competition with your rabbit. But if you'll notice, folks, the weeds, although there's lots of them there, because of the way I painted the background and I didn't detail them out too much, they don't compete with the painting or the main subject, okay? Even these close-up ones, they kind of go in and frame in the rabbit. That's exactly what you do whenever you do anything like this, is you utilize your subject as your focal point and you let the things around it help hold your attention. For instance, on a scene like this now, let's put the table in here in a little different fashion. Now then, if I were to take this table, instead of having it straight across, I now see the ends of it. And what do those ends do? They pull your eye back in towards your center of interest. And if it's a wooden table, you can put the wood in here and perspect these wooden slats to where your eye now even continues more to go back into your particular painting. And perhaps you can have a shadow here from your light source that's coming this way, and you've got the flowers and so forth. Now all of a sudden you've created a wonderful arrangement here that creates good eye flow. It has good negative space, but there's still a couple of components here that are important that I want to point out to you. Now, just like on the rabbit, by the way, see, I've darkened the corners here. I've made less. There's not a whole lot of detail in any of these corners, so I'll stay focused here. Same thing with this. Now, as I finish this painting out, or this sketch, or whatever it is, I will most likely want to sort of create what we call a vignette. Now, a vignette is just simply focusing on your center of interest and allowing your background, specifically the corners, to kind of fade off into nowhere. In other words, there's no detail, there's no heavy work, and you just sort of darken your corners, creating this nice little pocket of focal point there. And by using good negative space around your objects, creating good eye flow, all of a sudden the painting does what it's supposed to do, okay? So that's one of the most important things I want you to understand whenever you decide to do a still life with fruits or vegetables or flowers, a portrait or a figure. It doesn't matter what it is. Be sure that you use good space around your object. Doesn't matter. Now then, let's move into one more little segment here. I'm going to recap a couple of things so that you'll understand more and more about the use of negative space in composition. Now, to give you a brief rundown of where we've been, we've got the three types of composition. We've got the triangle, the L shape, and the center type composition. Now also remember something, folks, that whenever you compose a painting, there are a lot of different sizes, shapes, and different formats you can use. Now here's another painting that's done in a very long, narrow fashion. Okay? Now, let me point out something here about this particular composition because it's so unusual. And not so much that it's not out of line with our three types, but here's something that's kind of interesting. I want you to notice. I have an object or a subject now that's coming into the painting. All right, now I'm going to give you a real good little hint here. Never have anything that's a focal point or any subject that's important to the composition going away from the painting, going outside the painting. But it's all right to create eye movement going into the painting. You see this cow as he's walking towards the truck, and this cow with his leg positioned upward, you know he's walking in towards the truck. This cow is angling in. All of my grasses are moving in. My fence row and my road is pulling in, and my hillside is moving in. So look what we've created, folks. We've created, our center of interest is here. Every triangle is pointing towards it. So this is the type of composition where you have several subjects involved, or several objects, but they create several triangles that point right to your center of interest, okay? So I wanted to be sure you understand that it doesn't matter which type of composition you're using. If you have to satisfy that particular painting or whatever you're doing, some objects that are coming in on the edge of the canvas, be sure they are moving toward your center of interest, not away. I'll give you an example. I mean, it would not be good composition if you had this cow walking out of the canvas, okay? It just wouldn't work, because then your eye is moving so strongly towards the outer edge that it would create a major problem for you. And quite frankly, it creates some very unusual negative space. So keep in mind that the space that you have between your objects and everything should be pointing towards each other. Now, notice something else that's really exciting. We talked about overlap in the center type of composition. Well, quite frankly, folks, every time you put several subjects in a painting, you should have tremendous overlap. And I think I have another piece here that I can show you when we talk about overlap, how important overlap is. All right, here we go. Now, let's talk about this for a second. When we talk about composition, you've established your composition. This is a beautiful, beautiful rendition of this wonderful hawk. But look what's so interesting about this composition. Where does your eye focus? What makes it stay there? And why is it so effective? Okay? Number one, obviously, our eye focuses right here on the hawk. Okay? That's the key thing here. We want to focus on the hawk. That's what my initial intents was to focus on the hawk. But because I wanted it to have that Indian setting, once again, I had to get the TP in here, all right, without it being a competitor to the main subject. So whenever you know in advance that you've got a certain subject that you want to be the true focal point or center of interest, be sure that nothing else in the painting competes with it, all right? So here's how we get to that. First of all, if you'll notice, I offset the hawk way off to the left-hand side of the painting. Now there's a reason for that. It opens up all this big area of space so that I can utilize it to help balance and pull my eye through there. It creates more unique space. Now I'm going to talk to you a lot about negative space in this segment, because that's really what this painting is all about, folks, is about negative space. Notice something. All the beautiful tree limbs, all of the shape of the hawk, and all the space that's left, how wonderfully organized it is, and my eye flows gracefully through here. Now, we'll say a couple of things here. The TP is set far enough in the distance and is in a value system. In other words, at that point in the painting, it's in the right value system to be in that section of the painting, which we'll talk about values a little bit later. But it also is overlapped with this tree, okay? So all of a sudden now the TP becomes an integral part of the main feature. So we're not going to focus. Now, on the TP, if we had put the TP way up here, say on a hillside, separated from the main composition, the main subject, we would have created a pocket of negative space that would have been a deterrent to my focusing on this animal. Okay, do you understand what I'm talking about there? You wouldn't want to put this TP or any other subject over here, because then you fight. Your one eye looks over here, one eye looks here, and while this is a fairly complicated rendering, you still stay focused where you want to stay focused, because I have all of this stuff going on overlapping. There's not one thing in here that doesn't pull you back into the main subject. The tree line, for instance, instead of making my tallest tree here and it go this way, I made my tallest tree here. Look where my eye comes, follows the line of the trees here, all right? And all of a sudden hits this little collection of limbs, pulls me back to the hawk, all right? I wanted to have a substantial dead log because, frankly, when I see these hawks, they're on something massive usually that's rugged. So I wanted to create an atmosphere of ruggedness and sort of determination and something that was sort of symbolic to the Indian theme. And this natural setting right here is perfect. So what I did was I made the huge stump that was slightly angled like this, opening up a very unique piece of negative space on both sides. And then I took both of those pieces of negative space, broke them up with other limbs and things so that they don't just grab my attention. For just a moment, if you would, notice this triangle right here, this piece of space without the limbs in it. It becomes a big piece of space of emptiness that catches your attention. So does this one. So does this one. And some of these down here would grab your attention, just like on the rabbit I showed you. If you hadn't sort of blurred your background or filled up the space with sort of filler material, then the negative space becomes too important and all of a sudden it competes with your subject. All right? Now, so here's the secret. Anytime you're doing something with a lot of similar items like the tree limbs and so forth, be sure that you fill up any pieces of negative space that will contend with your main subject, okay? I can't give you enough information about that. That's so critical, folks, because I've seen so many people try to paint the birds and the animals. Now, see, for instance, here we have a much simpler rendition, okay? We have a very, very small amount of space. We have a very intensely lit, colorful bird, and the coloring is so clean and sharp, you don't really need all the help that you need in this particular piece because I only have one subject I want to focus on. Okay, so it was real easy to just hold my attention, but I did have to put a small tree here to break up this piece of negative space so that it wouldn't just catch my attention and hold it, all right? It just sort of breaks it up and kind of leads me back to my subject, all right? You get a little bit more complicated painting like this where you have 2 or 3 or 4 main subjects. It's important to overlap number one. Notice everything touches and overlaps something else. Lots of overlap here, folks. Lots of overlap. And then your negative space suddenly works for you instead of against you. Isn't that an exciting thing? I just think it's wonderful. And when I learned a lot about space, the little pockets of space between and around objects, that's what creates the interest in your painting, okay? So please concentrate now on space. And I'm going to give you a little homework assignment. I recommend that you go to museums, you go to any kind of major art show, professional showing, competitions, and start studying the true fine artists of this country because you're going to see all of these rules fall right into line. Sure, we all have our own little takeoffs of what composition is, what it means to us, but there's one thing we all have in common. Composition is the arrangement of objects on your canvas so that it is pleasing to the eye, and if it's not pleasing, you've done something wrong. And my recommendation for you is to go back to square one, plan A, and start from scratch and understand that there are really basically 3 types of composition, and you need to follow into one of those if you're going to have a successful painting. All right? Now let's get off of that for just a moment, and let's go back here to our plan. Now let's put this away here for a second. Composition, without the proper understanding or knowledge or use of it, can get you into all kinds of trouble. All right. Now, here's where we've been. We've talked about composition and what it means and what it is. We've talked about the 3 types. We just finished up with the center type composition and the use of negative space. Now we're going to talk a lot about negative space as we go on into our next few sessions and talks about composition because negative space follows us all the way through composition. It never leaves us, okay? The next thing we're going to talk about here, folks, is depth and perspective. Now we're going to be covering this here in our next session, so get ready for that because it's one of the most intriguing, most exciting, and probably one of the most important components of composition in order to create all that depth in a painting that you want to have. Now, let's give us I'm going to give you a brief rundown of what you can expect in our next section. You might want to do a little pre-planning, you might want to read up a little bit on it, but we're going to talk about depth and perspective. Now basically, folks, there are two things that cause depth in a painting. Now let me show you something here. In this particular painting, this is one of the things. Now when you look at this piece, one of the most important components of this painting that I think is neat is the depth in it. You can see way back in there, and quite frankly, that's probably almost a mile back to this range right here. Do you know what caused that? That's caused by understanding your value system. As things recede into the distance, now I want you to write this down because I want you to think about this between now and our next session. As things recede into the distance, they get smaller, closer together, and less intense in value. Okay? So that simply means that as these rock formations recede into the distance, they get smaller, which is obvious. They also get closer together, which simply means kind of like a row of fences, which we'll spend some time on in our perspective section. They get closer together. It's an optical illusion, but as they go into the distance, all of these objects that are alike will appear to be closer together. And then as you get further into the distance, every time you go back on one plane a little further, you now get less intense in value and not as strong in color, okay? So those are the two main things right there. Your value system, and then perspective. Now the perspective part of it is going to be probably the area that you're going to struggle with the most. So what I'd like for you to do is between now and our next section, maybe find a book on perspective. We're going to cover 1 and 2 point perspective only. Now those are the types of perspective that are just for you basic beginners, okay? Well, as usual, we're out of time. I have to go. I'm having so much fun, I don't really want to stop this. But we'll see you here next time, and I hope you stay inspired. God bless you. Keep painting, and we'll see you again real soon on another Inspiration of Painting.